welcome to our program tonight. My name is Miranda Patterson, and I am the cultural attaché here at the U.S. Embassy in Vienna. And I'm so excited to be welcoming everyone tonight for our final program in our Black History Month programming series. We've had a wonderful month that started with a talk from Professor Nikki Brown, who spoke about African Americans and voter engagement. And then we had a very interesting and very engaging panel discussion on the documentary Willie, which was about the first African American actually in the National Hockey League. And tonight we are so excited to welcome Professor Frazier, who will talk about the role of youth in various social movements. And our moderator will give you a little bit more info on her background. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and introduce our amazing moderator that we have tonight. Her name is Nermina Mumich, and she is the president of the Muslim Youth Austria organization, which is a very involved and active organization here in Austria. And Miss Mumich, she wears many hats because she is also the founder and CEO of her very own successful startup called Legendary. So I'm happy to welcome her, and stay tuned because if you're not able to join us, or if you have friends who aren't able to join us, this will be recorded, and you can find this conversation as well as the other conversations that we've had throughout the month on our website, which is at.usembassy.gov. And without further ado, I'll pass it over to Nermina.
Thank you so much, Miranda, for this kind introduction. I would also like to take the opportunity now to thank the US Embassy for their continued support. We share a long tradition of cooperation, and I'm especially proud to co-host this evening on the occasion of Black History Month together with the Embassy. This month is not only about understanding and learning Black history. This month we spotlight and celebrate Black achievement. As the Muslim Youth Austria, we have always been committed to education, building bridges, fostering dialogue and equality. And as the biggest Muslim youth organization in Austria, we aim to empower young people who are oftentimes marginalized and encourage their participation by various programs and activities. And this year we are proud to celebrate our 25th anniversary and invite you to engage in our program throughout the whole year. Part of our annual program is the Black History Month. In this month, as many others do around the globe, we try to highlight the accomplishments of Black people worldwide, celebrate Black role models, and also give space to discuss racism in all its structural and institutionalized ways and experiences of Black people in Austria, and also shed a light on social justice issues the Black communities are still facing. And the engagement in this discussion has a long tradition in the Muslim youth. We feel a special connection to the Black movement through figures like Malcolm X, who shaped our organization from the early days on. In many of our publications, we describe how hip hop and also Malcolm X served as a source of inspiration for our work. And that's why every year we invite young people to engage more deeply with Black history. And this also leads me to tonight's guests. We are very honored to welcome Professor Nishani Frazier, Associate Professor of American Studies and History of University of Kansas. Prior to University of Kansas, held positions as Associate Curator of African American History and Archives at Western Reserve Historical Society, and she was assistant to the director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Archives at the Martin Luther King Center of Nonviolent Social Change. She was also personal assistant to Dr. John Hope Franklin before and during his tenure as a chair of President Bill Clinton's advisory board, One America. As a historian, she works extensively on the 1960s freedom movements, oral history, digital humanities, food, as well as Black economic development and feminist theory. Today, she will talk to us about youth involvement in the context of historic civil rights movements, and what lessons today's youth can gain from these historic movements. So, Professor Nishani Frazier, we are very pleased to welcome you as our guest today. And dear audience, we are inviting you to ask your questions via the platform Slido at the end of the talk, and you will find the link in the caption of this live talk. So now I'm very pleased to hand over to Professor Frazier.
Thank you so much. Thank you again for that wonderful introduction, and thank you to the embassy for this invitation to speak about a movement I very much love. Most people know that my background is filled with civil rights activists who are family members. My father was a member of the NAACP in Mississippi. My mother was a member of CORE. Today I'm going to talk to you all about youth movements and talk about the relationship of the 1960s youth movement to Black Lives Matter. I'm going to begin by sharing my screen. And I'm going to start with an introduction that gives us a sense of the Black Lives Matter movement, and then from there transition to youth movements from the 1960s and its relationship to the current movement, particularly as it relates to the issue of police brutality.
Anybody growing up here, you tangibly know when you cross the county line, you got to drive a little differently. Your behavior changes because you know how policing changes.
We was just killed man in front of my apartment. People flooded in this area have some experience with the police.
Things have never been right for Black folks in America. We're trying to mourn, and you came here with 300 cop cars, right? You're in canine units.
You gonna shoot me too?
But that ain't the story that you hear about.
It is our duty to fight for our freedom!
It is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. This is actually a quote from Assata Shakur, who was a former Black Panther Party movement. A lot of people talk about Black Lives Matter is a different kind of movement, right? You saw the quote where it says, this is not your father's civil rights movement. But the truth is that it absolutely is the descendant of the 1960s civil rights movement. And it remains so in multiple areas, including origin, strategies and goals, and in terms of the challenges that they face with regard to state power. But overwhelmingly, it's the origins that intimately connect these two movements. And those origins of the movement generally tend to focus on issues of violence against Black youth. This is 1955, Emmett Till. It is both a famous and infamous case in which a young boy, and I'm going to emphasize boy here, and I'll get into what I mean by that later on, moves from Mississippi over the summer to visit his family. And in that period, a white woman by the name of Carolyn Bryant accuses him of inappropriately approaching her. It leads to her husband and some colleagues of his going to his family's home, kidnapping him, beating him to death, and tying a cotton gin fan of mechanical equipment to his neck and burying him or putting him in the Tallahatchie River. So the gruesomeness of what you are looking at has to do with them having found his body and his body being bloated and viciously beaten. His mother decides that she will have an open casket funeral. And she says, I want the whole world to see what the state of Mississippi did to my son. Emmett Till is an indelible mark on the Black freedom movement. Every student that was a part of the civil rights movement in the 1960s can pinpoint the moment they learned about Emmett Till. Emmett Till was killed in 1955, and the youth movement burst onto the scene in 1960. So the kids who are 14 years old at the same time that Emmett Till dies or is murdered at 14 years old are the kids that make up the youth movement of the 1960s. And this issue of violence and that Black youth face is not limited to the 1960s. In the 1970s, we have an incident in which a young man by the name of Tyrone Guyton has been killed by the police, and there's a huge effort to have a march and a rally to get some sort of justice for his death. He's 14 years old. Tyrone is 14. Emmett Till is 14. Tamir Rice is 12 years old. And he is a young man who is in Cleveland, Ohio. He is playing with a toy gun and is assumed to have an actual gun. The police jump out, and within 2 seconds of their arrival and shouting out that they are the police, they kill him dead. And these three sort of examples, right, of vicious violence against Black youth really sets the stage for why it is that these youth movements come into being, right? A lot of times, Black children are not seen as children, right? Even in terms of Mike Brown, who is the person who's most well known in terms of the Ferguson riots. He's 18 years old, but he's referred to as a man, all right? So Black boys, Black girls, they don't get to be youth. They don't get to be young. And when you are not youth and you're not young and violence can meet you at every turn, it's an impetus for pushing you into the movement. All of the kids that we see in the 1960s emerging come out of this experience. And one of the most well-known events is that of the Birmingham Children's March. We have children who are ages 8 upwards of 21, 22 years old who are participating in this major march.
D-Day was the day, I tell you. This was the day where every student in Birmingham knew that it was
that all of the planning was a secret.
Good. Go over there, Roland. Good morning, children. Up in the morning and out to school. The teacher is teaching the golden rule.
I remember that morning I woke up with my mind on freedom.
Oh, I took special pain with putting a little starch in my blouse.
And a toothbrush, and I got the toothpaste, the soap.
Because I had a feeling that I wouldn't be coming home.
Ring, ring goes the bell.
This doctor pushed D-Day early in the morning, but they wouldn't use D-Day. They use all that jive talk.
Don't forget, kids.
There's gonna be a party in the park, and don't forget your toothbrushes, because luncheon will be served.
Back in the classroom, open your book.
Now everybody who's listening know what the deal is.
D-Day was the day. My mother said, okay, when don't go to that march. I mean, don't go. You go to school. I told my mother, I said, I hear you. We were raised my So I didn't tell her a lie and say I wasn't going. I said, I hear you.
We would have people picked out. Your job is to turn this file on, turn that file on, get the football team, basketball team, get the cheerleader, get the band.
It was right at 11 o'clock when they arrived. They came up to the fence with a sign that just said, it's time.
When he said, let's go for the window.
And I told her, I said, come on, let's go. And I looked around and, all I could see was my own family almost, I hollered back up at those kids, but you said you were going to go. You promised. And that's when kids started coming.
They were coming out of windows, coming out of doors.
It's so beautiful. You would believe it. Mrs. Goree turned her back as we got up.
And we took it from there.
I wanted to walk out with him, but it was my job.
There was nothing you could do once the students started moving. The principal, the teachers, and everybody had to step aside.
My boyfriend tried to stop me from going. I walk around the building. I came right back at it and went.
You have about 2 children left in the class, maybe. Everybody's going.
I'm sure that morning Deborah was nervous about who was going to show up.
At first there were a few, then there were hundreds, then there were thousands.
We heard that kids were coming in from all over the city. And when we heard that they were coming in from out of town, we got more excited.
I had a cool car. They said, okay, we need you to ride to Fairfield. There's some students outside the classroom that want to go back in. Going home, when I got out to Fairfield, the whole campus was outside of the building, and they all said, we're going to Birmingham.
20 kids climbed on the car and 800 followed behind it.
I love the way you walk. I love the way you walk.
800 children follow behind. And when they reach Birmingham, they're using nonviolent direct action strategies, marches, in an attempt to challenge segregation within the city of Birmingham. The response to the youth march is incredibly vicious. One of the most well-known scenes is the one that you see in the right-hand corner, where the children are surrounded by the police. You see scenes of police using dogs to attack children. And this is in the spring of April 1963. The march and the images of the march go literally around the world. And it's a challenge, a deep challenge, this notion of the United States as a center of democracy and freedom, when you have children being attacked by fire hoses and by dogs and by police. In the fall of 1963, it appears as if there is going to be some movement, some change against segregation. And the response was to attack the 16th Street Baptist Church. And the 16th Street Baptist Church is the center of youth activism and the Birmingham March. On Sunday, there is a bombing of the church. 4 little girls are killed, and you see them in the lower right-hand corner. Addie Mae Collins, Carol Robertson, Cynthia Wesley, and Denise McNair. This is a dramatic moment during the civil rights movement, and it's marked by a number of dramatic moments: assassinations of Malcolm X, assassinations of Medgar Evers, eventually Martin Luther King, and it dramatically changes the way youth begin to think about how to exercise power to change the system. And this is when you begin to see the emergence of groups like the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party is established in 1966 as an armed self-defense organization. They transitioned away from that, but they outlined a set of goals, a belief system, right, with regard to how it is that you can challenge and transform inequality within the United States. They have a number of goals outlined, but I'm going to focus particularly on 7 and 8 because I think these are indicative of the circumstances of the Black response and protest response to policing. Number 7, we want an immediate end to police brutality and murder of Black people. We believe we can end police brutality in our Black community by organizing Black self-defense groups that are dedicated to defending our Black community from racist police oppression and brutality. The Second Amendment to the Constitution of the United States gives us a right to bear arms, and we therefore believe that all Black people should arm themselves for self-defense. We want freedom for all Black men in federal, state, county, and city prisons and jails. We believe that all Black people should be released from the many jails and prisons because they have not received a fair and impartial trial, right? They're hitting at this whole question of inequality in the criminal justice system. Now, this is a more radical transformation compared to the nonviolent direct action approach. They are using armed self-defense, but then they transition from armed self-defense into political education. And they begin to take a more aggressive and Marxist critique of the shared oppression of peoples of colors and poor people around the world. And so as an organization, they begin to change in their approach and their thinking with regard to how to deal with this problem of violence against Black youth and Black people in general. What you see in Black Lives Matter is a similar set of circumstances, right? They are guided by principles in part dictated by the violence that occurs against African American people. And when you go to their website and you look at their guiding principles and goals, they say we want an end to mass surveillance of Black communities and the end to the use of technologies that criminalize and target our communities, including IMSI catchers, drones, body cameras, and predictive policing software. And this, of course, predictive policing software is a part of this big data push, which ends up setting up or asserting the notion that Black spaces are criminal spaces that require an excessive level of policing. So you'll see here the strategy begins to change because it's focused on the ways in which technology is brought to bear against Black people, in addition to the violence that then occurs against Black youth, including being shot and killed. So what they do is they have a larger conversation about the ways in which violence is being done against Black people in terms of privacy issue and in terms of actual physical violence itself. And as a result, they also have similar challenges. The state response to all of these cases is to be very aggressive, generally labeling them as subversive or agents against the United States. During the 1960s, there's a massive attack against the Black Panther Party and other Black radical groups, including infiltrators in the middle image. What you see is actually a deathbed confession that was released this Saturday from Ray Wood, who was known to have been an infiltrator, Black New York police officer who infiltrated into the Congress of Racial Equality. And it was argued that when CORE started to focus on police brutality is exactly when the New York Police Department began to bring to bear its forces of surveillance. Ray Wood went from a focus on CORE to Black Panther Party, Revolutionary Action Movement, but he's also most notoriously known for his presence at the Audubon. And I'm sure anybody who knows the history of the United States in the 1960s knows where I'm going here. The Audubon is the location of the assassination of Malcolm X. And it is believed that Ray Wood was not only present, but his series of infiltration activities is what helped set the fate and the circumstance that would eventually lead to the assassination of Malcolm X. So again, surveillance is key to challenging these groups. And in the right-hand corner, you see a gentleman from Black Lives Matter saying, "I am not a threat." And in part, this is a response by Black Lives Matter, not only to how policing takes place of Black people, but the ways in which the federal government and the FBI have asserted that Black Lives Matter is construed as what they call a Black identity extremist. This is a terminology that's meant to assert that as an organization, because of their extreme identity of Blackness, that they are potentially enemies of the state or potentially could harm the state. And of course, this flies in the face of the history of why there is protests and movements against police in the first place, right? Historians have demonstrated that the issue of police brutality is not a function of 1960s moving forward. That's only where I'm choosing to start. There are histories and circumstances going well into the 1800s, and new literature is starting to come out that talks about this long history, if you will, of police brutality. But I do think it's important that we begin to think about the power of youth, right? And that the things that happen to them serve both as an origin point for why resistance occurs, and all the ways that these movements demonstrate the power of mass action by youth, and the power of resistance and the ability to challenge inequality in order to change the world. I will end our discussion right there and take questions.
Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and these insights. So I will start taking questions, and I want to remind the audience that you can ask your questions via Slido, and you will find the link in the caption of this video. So the first question is, what are simple ways youth can act as advocates for the equality besides protests?
So one of the things that I find interesting is that people talk about nonviolence, and they always focus on direct action, protests, right, the marches. But these are visible expressions of how you challenge a system. The most powerful element of nonviolence, which people tend to forget, is non-cooperation. That is, you're leading a boycott against corporations, companies, businesses, and entities that participate in activities of inequality and or racism. When you look at what happens with Dr. King and the Montgomery bus boycott, right, you get the image of people who are protesting and marching, but the bus is being brought down to, the bus company is being brought down to its knees because the Black community refuses to give them their money to get on that bus. So money can be a powerful tool for challenging these entities. And that's just one route away that you can do it. Education is also another route, quite frankly. A lot of people are profoundly ignorant of the issue of racism and various communities and what forms that it takes. They don't have a sense of what it is, and they tend to categorize it as something that, you know, everybody has a problem, right? Why don't you get over your problem? But you have to help construct it as a massive, systematic, structural issue that it is, right? So that people have a full understanding of the import of racism on people's everyday life, right? I wake up in the morning dealing with racism, and I go to bed right before I go to bed dealing with it. And it impacts health, and it impacts economy, and it impacts politics, all these other things. And then I think it also depends on what community you're in, but political engagement is another really, really important tool. You're beginning to see in the United States the rise of women in Congress, of communities of color, and they are raising very uncomfortable questions for the United States. Not uncomfortable for me, I don't have no problem. But for a lot of people, it's a problem because they are challenging the way in which the United States has functioned as a nation state. And I don't mean just in terms of issues of racial inequality. That's just one thing in a line of inequalities that these folks are addressing. And when you look at people like AOC, who's really popular, or the squad as they're known, right? They talk a lot about green technology and climate change. These are particular circumstances that dramatically affect communities as well, right? So having political power can be a major tool for change and transformation.
So thank you for this, and also a couple of questions regarding the Black Lives Matter movement. As you mentioned in your talk, it's a direct descendant of the movements in the 1960s. And here is a question: what role, particularly the youth, played now in the Black Lives Matter movement?
Well, it can be a sort of both, right? First of all, Black Lives Matter is a youth movement, and aggressively, assertively so. That means no old people. And they're not shy about saying it just like that, right? And in part, that's because youth offer or assert a way of challenging these systems that's not based on negotiation necessarily, that's not based on a slow process of building up or building toward, right? Change. This is the power of youth. Nobody, I've met youthful is like, I could wait 10 years to see something come to fruition. They want it right now. So the Black Lives Matter movement is, quite frankly, almost strictly a youth movement. Does that mean older people are not present? No, that was never the case. Student Nonviolent Coordinated Committee in the 1960s was a youth movement, but the woman who transformed the organization was in her 60s. That's Ella Baker. She's the major strategist for the youth. So there are people who are older who provide insight. And the Black Lives Matter movement tends to turn to people with a history of the radical connection. So formerly members of the Black Panther Party, members of SNCC, that there tends to be a kind of feedback and interaction with those organizations, more so than the early civil rights groups. So I hope that answers all the questions about how much is it the youth movement, and was the question?
Yes, that was the question. And write another question regarding Black Lives Matter movement is here. Just lost the question. What you mentioned is that young people, they challenge the structural inequality, and you were talking a lot about structural inequality. And I know from the whole discourse that if you face and see structural inequality, usually or how it should be is that it's not the obligation of the oppressed group to fix the system. It's rather the duty and the task of people who take advantage from the structural inequality to fix the system. So what are points what we should demand from these people? What are points to fix it?
No, I think that's an excellent question. Power conceives nothing without demand. It never has, it never will, right? So these people are not going to hand over power and say, I feel so bad, right? You have to outline for them, what does empowerment look like for you? One of the ways that people have begun to talk about it here in the United States has to do with pay equality, right? Thinking about ways of evening out salaries so those who are on the lowest rung can have an opportunity to move forward and have a stable living condition. This is why you see a lot of people focus on the minimum wage here in the United States. Mostly people of color and working class people are dealing with this issue of not being able to move forward with home ownership and things like that. So a minimum wage has been one of the key circumstances here as a way of getting at these structural problems. I'm not a person who believes that you get a representative in a structure and then all of a sudden it magically becomes not racist anymore. That's not how it works. You have to think about a twofold or two layers and levels of a circumstance. You both incorporate the presence of communities of color, but you incorporate them in the context of having power and say. So if you let everybody work in your business and they all sweep on the floor, that does not give them power and say in terms of the change and transformation of your business, right? So you have to think about these things in tandem, right? This is a question not of representation Structural racism is about power. So always the question is, how can these people begin to release power and then allow for a shared power or participatory power within institutions, whether it's government institutions and or corporate or economic institutions. Now, some of this will require that you simply seize it, right? So in terms of political space, right, these are structures where you're going to have to, you can get in and you can seize it, but you're going to have to hammer away because these things are locked into place and they operate in a particular kind of way. But if you get at it, right, you can begin to drag it. It's not necessarily a quick process, but you can begin to drag it where you want it to go. The Democratic Party being a good example, it's on the one hand, it reflects a policy. Democratic Party is a party, political party within the United States. There are two major parties. We can't seem to break out of that. We're just two parties, right? Democratic Party, Republican Party. Democratic Party is considered the most liberal party. But even in being considered liberal, right, the levers of power had not been granted to people of color. Service on committees, service over budgets, leadership in terms of spokespersons. So you have to assert yourself into those spaces and challenge people at every turn. In the meantime, they just simply have to give up power. This is not a, you know, I'm not going to be Pollyanna about it. You got to give up power. That's it. And you can do it gracefully, or you can be forced to do it.
Thank you so much. I mean, talking about power, something that is also related to power is finances. And it was also mentioned. And a question is, there is certainly still an imbalance in terms of finances, and how can the community proceed here to overcome these hurdles?
So y'all don't ask no easy questions. I will tell you that one of the things that I work on, and you'll see two books in the corner here. This is Soul City, this book right here. This one is Harambee City. This is my book. This is a colleague of mine's book. One of the ways that Black activists in the 1960s addresses inequality of finances deals with an approach called cooperative economics. They attempt to pool wealth and then group share wealth. All right, so this is not the sort of hierarchical kind of framework that one normally sees with capitalism. Instead, it's a kind of breaking, if you will, or a molding of capitalism so that it's a more of a network of wealth building, right? So instead of the one, you have the multiple. And this circumstance of Soul City, Black activists thought about cooperative economics in business ownership, right? And in community building, so that all monies that were produced or created a profit did not profit one individual. It went back into the community. And I'll talk about this in Harambee City, right? So a number of entities are attempting to do that here in the United States, is kind of cooperative ownership. One of the responses to gentrification, and I'm assuming y'all have the issue of gentrification there, it seems to be a global set of circumstances affecting working class people, but in that particular circumstance, here they produced or started to introduce what they call community land trust. So in that circumstance, you give your home to the community nonprofit organization. And the community nonprofit organization then ensures that when you move, someone who is also working class and needs an affordable home can access the home and then also have a livable place. And what it does is it takes the money out of these major investors and developers and controls the space for the community. So, and the community then acts as a shield against these kinds of financial pressures. So these are just two examples in terms of community development and housing. They have proper ideas of how to even out these issues of finances and financial inequity, right? And now if we were talking about just a straight job, part of the way to do that is what a colleague refers to as kind of radical openness, right? Having a clear understanding of how your company pays people within it, right, allows you to make a determination as to whether there's a discrepancy between gender payment or racial differences in terms of payment and salary. Because this happens a lot in the United States and elsewhere, right, where certain kind of decisions are made. Unionizing is another way, because through unionizing, you can force the entity to say that we all have to have basic borderline access to income, access to benefits. Take a look at what we call Mondragon enterprises in Spain, because in that circumstance, it's not community ownerships, but employee ownership of businesses. And in that particular circumstance, if there's a problem with the business, the collective makes a decision about whether they'll cut their own pay, how to deal with production. So again, this is way of flattening, right, the process so that people have shared power and then shared access to finances.
Thank you so much for explaining that a little deeper. A question getting back to the role of children and youth is that Black children are known to grow up with the talk about to deal with leaders and how to act when being pulled over by police. And what does that do psychologically to a Black child always being afraid of being killed?
I think that you can use your imagination and you can imagine what it does. It creates a constant state of fear and hesitancy, even about wanting to stand up for your rights, right? So for example, there are a number of circumstances. In fact, there's a well-known video of a young man who stopped by the police and they stop him. And I've also seen this where this young college students would stop them right in front of my house. And I'm listening to this police officer and he says, well, there's been, a problem in history of stealing cars. And so, we're just checking your car. Why? Is my car on the list of stolen vehicles? No, you just determined that my Black behind in this car must mean that it was stolen, not because you actually know there's a stolen car. Now, in that circumstance, with a young man who had a similar experience, right? As soon as he was stopped, not only did it, clearly have a state of anxiety, but he provided all of his information. My name is such and such. My social security number is this. My driver's license number is this. He is on the ground and he's quoting all of this information while being placed in handcuffs because he's trying to validate himself. He's trying to validate his citizenship and he's trying to validate himself as a law-abiding citizen. So what that does is create a circumstance of not just fear, but a kind of dissonance about what does it mean to be a citizen and how one is going to be treated as a citizen. And if you are not treated as someone who is to be protected, right, then you become treated as someone who is a danger. And so you're in a state of constantly trying to prove that you are not dangerous.
Thank you for your explanation. I mean, also during your talk, it really struck me when you mentioned that also Black children are not seen as children. And that's what we see, that people are dehumanized and not enjoying their rights as citizens and are also considered as second-class citizens.
Right.
And also the implications of that. So thank you for this. There was another question that was also highly ranked regarding Black Lives Matter. It's that, what are your thoughts on Black Lives Matter, both as a movement and as a statement of fact? Because there are lots of misconceptions about the terms, and what are your thoughts on that?
So my belief in terms of misconception of terms has to do with the inability of many in the United States to deal with their history of racism. And because those people are recalcitrant and where they are, I'm going to be frank in saying that what they have say has no validation for me. They are not the victims. They don't have the experience of it. It's just a way to undermine those who actually are the victims. And so their sort of need to assert that all lives matter and that kind of thing is a red herring, the phrase for a way of distracting from both the experience of Black people and the words that they're saying, and basically to question and challenge the validity of what they're saying. And I'm from the South. You know, if you calling me a liar, we got problems. So I'm just going to tell you, I don't countenance that. And that is not about an actual true sense of all people having equity. This is simply about trying to dismiss what Black people are trying to say. And those are people who would dismiss what we're saying regardless. Black Lives Matter. I'm going to say it's complicated. Okay, what do I mean by complicated? They've done some things that are good, and they've done some things that are missteps, right? Just because we cheer a movement on doesn't mean that they cannot improve. One of the things that would probably help them is to see themselves as more a part of the 1960s movement than they like to construct. They like to say, this is not your daddy's civil rights movement, right? Because they want to situate themselves as a cutoff between what they view as the attempt to persuade, right, the state to extend rights. But they're not in the mindset of persuasion, right? Their position is, by value of birth, the rights are ours. By value of being human beings, the rights are ours. And so we're simply saying, you will give it to us. This is not a function of persuasion, all right? That being said, that doesn't mean that they're not elements that you can pull from that will empower you in terms of your strategy. Communication is one of the strongest things that Black Lives Matter is able to do. But strategy could definitely be enhanced and improved in terms of mass movements. Now, part of the reason that the strategy is a kind of a hodgepodge has to do actually with the history of the surveillance, right? If you as an organization had a leader and your leader is constantly targeted, what you then to do is diffuse the leadership, right? But if you diffuse the leadership, at the same time, you may have one chapter doing one thing and one chapter doing another thing. And so it can disrupt the cohesiveness. So it's a kind of double-edged sword. On the one hand, you have to diffuse it so that we understand that the movement is a leader-full, I don't like to say leaderless, leader-full movement. Everybody is a leader, everybody can participate, and it's incredibly empowering for students. And at the same time, it can undermine a kind of cohesiveness in terms of how the different chapters are functioning.
Mm. And talking about leaderful movements and also different strategies, here is a question. How did Malcolm X, in your opinion, impact the social justice movement differently than other leaders, like, let's say, Martin Luther King Jr., because their approaches were considered widely as different? And where do you see the differences, but also the analogies? And what can we today learn from them?
Sure. So this is interesting because people tend to think that there's a wider sort of distinction in their approach than what really is the case. For example, Malcolm X believed in armed self-defense. His position is that's the American way, and he's right. It's in the Second Amendment. It's buried literally within the Constitution of our United States. You have the right to bear arms for your protection. But people assumed that because Dr. King believed in nonviolence, that he didn't have that history. When he was in the Montgomery bus boycott, there are stories of so many guns being in the house. In fact, one Black journalist is about to sit down in the chair, and a very well-known LGBTQ Black activist, Bayard Rustin, says, "Don't sit there," right? Because he is literally, and I say this both figuratively and literally, going to get his butt blown off, right? If he sits in this chair full of guns. So Dr. King actually undergoes a transition away from armed protection. He's got to protect his wife and his kids, right? People are throwing dynamite at his house, to this space of non-violence and Christian ethos and things like that. So the sort of notion that there's two drastic separations is not quite. There's a history of Black armed rebellion throughout the Black experience. And that's, of course, not unusual for a group of people who are violently targeted. So they're not quite that different in that way, although Dr. King does follow the full path of nonviolence. They're also not quite that different in terms of economic pressure. Now, but their approach to economic pressure is different. Dr. King uses economic boycotts, which we do not use enough of, to force these corporations, businesses, and cities to the table, to effectively say, you cannot use our money and then do harm to us, economic harm, social and political harm, right? Malcolm X believes that we simply isolate ourselves away from those entities and economically build ourselves separately. So this is where you get soul sick, right? Because the belief system of Malcolm X is based in a very long political thought called Black nationalism. Black nationalism assumes that racism is forever present in the United States. It will never change, right? And we can talk about, you know, if that's just like, right, racism never change. So raise questions about why fight, right? But because it's predicated on the notion that racism is omnipresent, always existing at all times, then the solution is to create a space for yourself, a territorial space, a whole city, an economic space right here, your whole businesses, your own schools, your own institutions, all of this are separate. So Malcolm X asserts the idea of Black nationalism. Dr. Frank, I'm sorry, I'm thinking about a presentation I just did. Dr. King is critiquing the system, right? He does critique capitalism. He does critique militarism. But he does also believe that a Black community can bring a moral force into the space and change the body politic of the United States to operate and think differently through the spirit of nonviolence, or represented in the spirit of nonviolence. So they're alike and they're not alike, right? Malcolm X's impact is tremendous, but it's not necessarily in terms of strategy, right? What Malcolm X does is bring the critique to the Black community, and it's not an unknown critique, but publicly, right? To say it publicly is what makes him so incredible. He brings the critique about the very nature of the United States itself. And what he argues is that if the apple is corrupt, what then do you do in or with the space? And after the death of the 4 little girls, after the death of Medgar Evers, after the death of Malcolm X, the violence over and over again, Sherman, Goodman, and Cheney, 9 people were found while they were looking for these 3 civil rights activists in woods and swamps and rivers. People are dead. There becomes a question about the fundamental ability of the United States to change and transform itself. And all the things that Malcolm X has been saying just is reinforced through all of this violence. And so in part, that's why a lot of Black youth are pushed more assertively toward Malcolm X over time, right? Not that they are on Dr. King's side, because they have critiques of Dr. King as well, but they become more radicalized and more assertive based on the circumstances. So he's powerful in the critique, but not necessarily in the strategy. Not everybody's wanting to go create a whole town. That's a lot of work, okay? You got to put pipes in, a water system in, right? So the strategies don't quite meld, but the power of the critique does.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts on this. Another question to both of us. What are the experiences of the Muslim youth when it comes to racism in Austria? And if I see any similarities to Black people? And a question for you, Nishani, do Muslim people face racism in the US? And do the communities work together to combat that? I would ask you to start.
Okay. Yes, honey. Yes, there is racism. There's sexism. And certainly Muslim people absolutely face discrimination in the United States. Now, let's be clear. Yes, Muslim people face discrimination, but how shall I put this, right? Both the physical manifestation and the national or ethnic location means that not every Muslim is the same. Okay, what do I mean by that? Right? What I mean is, if you're coming from Iran, your Islam is not the same as someone who is coming from not only of actual edict and belief system, I mean in terms of how it's conceived and treated, right, by people in the United States. Now, for most people, it's just any kind of Muslim is a problem because they see themselves as a Christian-based nation. But then even within that is the layers of where you're from, right? That sort of marks you as more dangerous, say, than some other Muslim from another country. So you do have those variations, but overall, it applies to everybody, right? With regard to working with Black people, this is very interesting, and this has been an interesting conundrum, because there has been a history of Black Muslims in the United States for a long time. Enslaved people came and they are buried, and all of the sort of ritualistic, funerary ritualistic expressions of Islam are seen actually in enslaved people's graves, right? But within the United States, Islam becomes kind of mixed, the same way that Christianity becomes mixed, right, within an African tradition. So you have Noble Drew Ali at the early turn of the century in the 1900s, and he introduces this mix of Islam, Asiatic, Black nationalism kind of mix. Malcolm X, for a long time, was not accepted by Muslims, and that is because he was a part of the Nation of Islam. And the Nation of Islam is not considered by anybody, and I don't mean just, Sunni, or I mean by any Muslim, as a Muslim organization, because it doesn't follow the edicts in the same way. Not they don't follow it, but not in the same way. So because it's this mix, right? This kind of, I don't want to say watered down, but it's sort of like Santeria or Candomblé, where you have this mix of Christianity and Africanness to give you something totally different, right? You have Islam, Black Islam, that's this mix of Blackness, like nationalism and Islam, and they give you something totally different. So what it means is that for a long time, there was some difficulty in Muslim to Black interaction, because the entree would have been what we call the Black Muslims, and the Black Muslims are not constructed as full Muslims in the context of the Quran and the edicts and requirements of the Quran. The Hajj being one example. If you can afford, you can do the you're asked to do the Hajj, but that was not necessarily an edict within Black Muslim, right? Or Ramadan, which we know is a moving schedule, right? But in the United States, Black Muslims would situate Ramadan in December, and it didn't move because they were trying to transition Black Christian people from Christianity into Islam. And they did it by situating Ramadan in December so that at Christmas time, you would be celebrating what? Eid, right? So the gift giving part would still be comforting and something that sort of Black Muslims could connect with in terms of the broader Black community. That has changed. I would say since 2011, quite honestly, you see more assertive participation and collaboration in terms of resistance. But Malcolm X is often disconnected from the Nation of Islam part because that's a little bit uncomfortable dealing with the Nation of Islam.
Thank you for your perspective on this. I see that our time is coming towards an end. So I would like to thank you. I would like to thank you for sharing your expertise and giving the talk to us today. And I would hand over to Miranda.
Hi, thank you both again, Professor Fraser. This was really lovely. I definitely learned a lot, and I really enjoyed the fact that you were able to share your perspective with an international audience. I know sometimes our audiences overseas are definitely watching what is happening in the United States, but I really think it's valuable that people like you who are there and who have really studied and researched things from the historical perspective and can put it in the context of today is really valuable. So I really appreciate it. I hope everyone learned something because there were definitely some gems dropped tonight. So if you didn't catch it all, or if you're coming in late, or if you have a friend who wants to watch it later, as I said, it's going to be on our website. And I hope you can check it out. And I wanted to give the floor over to Professor Fraser again, in case you had any closing remarks.
Thank you again for this wonderful invitation. If there are any students or persons who still have questions, I'd love to engage in conversation. And it's sometimes hard to sort of do a long backstory history the way you want to. So feel free to reach out if you have additional questions. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much. Good night, everyone.